I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes about the project I've been running in the business engagement group, which is to do a citizen-led research study into answering the question, just how well are Wiltshire businesses tackling the climate crisis? And in that time, I'll briefly cover what we did and why we did it. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at just how big businesses is and why business is an important thing, even though it isn't much talked about by people in the environmental sector. Quick whiz through the main results and then some of the recommendations we put together for change. And then time permitting, we will have a small breakout. And in the breakout, I'd like people to be focusing on the sort of, well, just what the hell can we do to bring about change in business? I think that'd be the main question. So in the last year, I kind of came into this role last year, about February, March time as the business engagement lead. And we really didn't have any idea just what businesses in Wiltshire are really doing in terms of changing the way they run their operations to take account of the impact they have on the climate. So we felt that you couldn't really go and engage with people around Wiltshire unless you had something to say. So we decided it'd be a good idea to try and answer that question and find out what are Wiltshire businesses doing in general, get some sort of a sample survey about the state of managing climate change in businesses operating across the county. That was going to be a serious amount of work, so we recruited some volunteers. People from all over the country popped up to the job description we put out and came onto it. We then spent quite a bit of time thinking, well, how do you do this in a way that makes it valid, quantified and semi-scientific? And so we developed an assessment system that would enable us to score and assess various aspects of people's policy and actions on climate change. And when we got going, we were initially had a list of about 54 companies that had been put forward by members of the WCA as potentially big impact organisations. And we set about analysing the publicly available information from each of those, their website policy, their reported strategy, their accounts at Companies House, which should also include reference to their carbon emissions. And that really took us from sort of May, June through till November, quite a lot of work. We ended up with a hardcore team of about 5 people working away, busy hours over weekends and time in the vans to do the work. And then we, in the back end of last year, we got on with turning all the findings into a report. There's a lot of analysis done, and now we're ready to publish that information. So just to give you a snapshot on sort of how big and important business is, because I don't think people spend much time thinking about it. In the UK as a whole, there are 5.5 million registered organisations who are limited companies. Now, if you discount 4 million of those who are people who are just a home worker who made themselves a limited company, they're not providing any employment. There's still these 1.4 million organisations working away with employees doing stuff to make economic value. And clearly when they do that, they know they always have some carbon impact. But if you counter that with the number of organisations who are currently mandated by UK government to actually do stuff, then there's only 12,000 very large firms that fall within the government's rules about who has to do some carbon monitoring and reporting. It's all the very big firms. So actually only 0.8% of firms in the UK have any duty or regulated duty to report on their CO2 emissions, even though every single one has to do VAT and money and accounts and all that stuff. It is worth saying, however, that that small number, that 0.8% are the big mega firms. So they do represent apparently 39% of total turnover, but it's not a very big coverage. Bring that down to the Wiltshire level to try and get the number of firms operating in Wiltshire. The only bit of data I can find is that there are 13,000 premises registered for business rates. So at some time in the last few years, they've had active businesses doing stuff in those business rate areas. And we know from some work we did last year looking at a bid model of the UK done by for BIS that if you take business and commercial activity in Wiltshire and you allocate the transport to that, then you end up with about 54% of all the direct emissions, the stuff that goes up the stack, is to do with business. So, but of course, in business, you don't just get the direct emissions to do with the actual operating of the factory site and the use of electricity on that site. The big hitter for most businesses is all their scope 3, which is all the supply chain, getting the raw materials out of the ground, getting it converted into a format they can use it, doing something with it to make windows, doors, cars, food, whatever they produce, and then the distribution and logistics and transport, the use of the product. Imagine if all car companies had to count the emissions of the use of their products for the lifetime. So that's much bigger. The conclusion of this little quick snapshot study is that if you can't take business along with you on the journey to low carbon neutral Wiltshire, you haven't got a hope in hell of achieving the targets. This is just a little sketch to remind. I will talk about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 a little bit. Scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are the direct ones. And as I've said, all the supply chain is scope 3. So what we did is we decided we'd look at these range of headings when we did our scoring. We had 45 questions that we pulled together from a survey of all the different types of certification schemes that we looked at, global ones, local ones, etc. And we split that down into trying to allocate scores to how good is the policy, are there targets and goals set, is the reporting of a good quality that makes it useful, has there been real engagement with stakeholders in the organisation, is there a clear line of governance, and then, probably more importantly, even though they've got targets and goals and policy, have they actually achieved anything significant yet, these firms? And what are they saying about where they've got to? What's the performance that results? And when all that was done, the assessor had the opportunity to give them an overall, bit like your headmaster school report. Overall, I'm giving them this score out of 10 for what they did. And we banded that into 3 levels, red, amber, green, as you can see from the scores on the side. Typically, on each section, we then had a load of drill down questions. So this is the one about the policy, and these are all the different areas we asked people to go into. So we did as much detail as we could and worked pretty hard to get to the nitty-gritty points. Didn't just do it on one thing. The types of firms in our 50 that we looked at, in the end, they were mostly large organisations. And we seem to find that mostly people were looking at manufacturing and logistics type firms. And I think that's because we just asked people to submit company names that they thought might be big potential impactors. So you'd look to the big factory on the side of your town with a big stack, or the one with a lot of lorries that you see driving around. And they seem to be the ones that we mostly studied. So it's not a random sample that's a distribution of all the types of business in Wiltshire. It's ones that were put forward. So let's now quickly get into the results. The full report is available to download here now. There's 40 pages, some detail in the middle. You can just look at the executive summary and the main pictures and read our recommendations if you don't want to read 40 pages, perhaps not this evening. This is our overall big graph that I quite like this one because it's an attempt to show the headline results on one graph. What this shows is, along the bottom is the possible score you could get, up to 10. Up the side, frequency, the number of firms that got that score. So 9 of the companies we looked at scored absolutely 0, nada, nil. Basically, once you'd search for the word environmental, climate, sustainability, anything at all in their website or their published information, if those words are not being mentioned, you're looking at a firm that's saying nothing about what they do. And you have to assume that they're probably not doing much. All the way through, we could only operate on what companies say they are doing. we couldn't get inside and see what they were actually doing. And so then you see a large number of firms in our red, well below OK level, quite a few in the middle yellow stage, and not that many, only 9 in our sort of green, looks pretty good band, no firms scoring 9 or 10 at all. So I think the phrase in the school report, could do better, is probably being quite fair. We might as well just go straight. I haven't got time to go into detail about whether people's policy were better than their targets or whether their reporting standards were better than others. Let's just try and pick out some of the main threads. This table, which goes over several slides, ranks all those 49 firms from the top of the league down to the bottom. And this is the top 9 who scored in our green band of traffic light colouring system. It's pretty okay. You can see that they're all mostly large, more than 250 plus employees, and therefore it's pretty fair to assume that our large ones were the ones who have to do some carbon reporting. The 2 marked around in red are smaller companies, good energy, a relatively local, sustainable power supply business, and Hobbs House Bakery, nice homely natural bread suppliers. And that's interesting because they aren't actually regulated to have to do anything. They've chosen to do some good quality carbon reporting and put that out there about their business because it fits with the culture and ethos of what they do. So they're the only 2 non-large companies in the top firms. This is the whole next down, probably just scan your eyes down all the names on the left. If anyone's interested in finding out more, we do have a detailed breakdown for each firm. And you can see that still mostly the large companies are in our sort of mid-range section. Lower range score, getting into the bottom half of the league table now. Still quite a lot of large companies and smaller firms creeping in. And to, you know, a big firm like Dyson only scoring 2 is not that impressive, really. And then down at the lower end, all these firms down in our 1s and 0s area. So those are the headline results. There's a lot more detail in the report, but I'll just pull out, having spent a long time looking at the data and thinking about what we could really observe. Here's some blindingly obvious facts and findings that we got. And one would perhaps assume that you could extrapolate this to the UK. Generally, in the UK, certainly in Wiltshire, the firms we looked at, only the large firms are the ones who are doing the most. And that's because they have to. We also found that if you find a strong governance policy, it's clear who's in charge, the policy is well written, the targets are clearly stated. That tends to follow through as a trail of good management saying that they will deliver good results. As you probably picked up from the league table, as a broad generalisation, small and micro-sized firms, less than 50 staff, nearly all have nil policy and aren't doing very much. So there's a huge gap there. The Scope 3 emissions, which I touched on earlier, under the UK regulated rules, firms don't have to report their Scope 3, only their direct Scope 1 and 2. But the really enlightened firms should be able to do it. It's not really difficult, but generally we found that even the bigger firms were ignoring a lot of their Scope 3 impacts. And those that had looked at their Scope 3 emission measuring looked at the easy to measure things like how much of a material they're buying, because they already record that, or how much our transport's costing us, or are our staff using public transport to come into work. Very few were looking at things like, what is the impact of all these products we've sold once they get used out there in the marketplace? What happens to the products at end of life? What is the downstream impacts that result from the commercial products we've sold? So that was pretty poor. We had a good go as we could at working out whether companies were actually what we called on track, if there was evidence that said they were on track to get to where they said they were going to be by 2030 and 2050. And that's pretty difficult because most firms have only been working on this in the sort of started about 2018, 2019, 2020. Those are the most common baseline years from which they start measuring their journey. And within the period we were looking at, we only really got reports up to 2021 in a few cases. You had 2 or 3 years for doing a trend, and those were interrupted by the massive pandemic impacts. So it's really hard to tell now at this early stage whether these firms are on track going forward. And we only found 4 where there was some evidence that they possibly are on track. The other thing we picked up is, as you might expect, if you had this job in a big company, you do the easy things first. So you switch your power to a renewable power supplier. If you've got a big factory, you might put some solar panels on the roof. You probably switch all the lighting in the factory over to LED. You tell all the managers who've got a company car they're going to have an electric car soon by 2025. And those are pretty common threads. Pretty easy to do. And nearly all of those lead into a demonstrable, pretty rapid payback thing. But what worried me here is that for many organizations, the really big core of their impact is the main thing they do. So, you know, we were surprised to see an organization like Tarmac and Wincanton at the top of our league table, because based on what they say they're doing really well. But they hadn't really addressed their fundamental stuff. If you put bitumen on roads and sell cement to make things, and that's 85–90% of what you do, until there's a solution for bitumen and cement, there's not a great deal you can change in your business other than the things I mentioned, the easy wins. If you make plastic pipes from oil-based plastic using energy and heat to shape those pipes, if that's your core thing, which one of the firms does, once you've done the easy wins, the really hard hitters are tackling your fundamental stuff that you do. And I didn't see a massive amount of evidence of that happening. A company like Nestle that we got looking at, because Cereal Partners in Wiltshire are part of Nestle, they spent ages with an amazing amount of money saying how wonderful their new regenerative treatment of people growing cocoa beans and palm oil is going to be, and they're going to manage those areas so that they're fully regenerative, and it's going to be lovely. If you're going to have a lovely lifestyle, we'll look after them. So you can eat your chocolate and your Easter eggs, knowing that our supply chain is living a nicer life. But they still buy 65 million tons of milk a year. And until they challenge that, I can't see they're really going to have a big impact. Anyway, we shall crack on. There's a bit of evidence of green hushing, we think. Firms who are not saying what they're actually doing, they're just maintaining radio silence because they're worried about perhaps saying we're going to get to X by this time, and then they never get there. So they just keep quiet. Clearly, consumer-facing brands, we found, are the ones who are most likely to make a big show of doing a good job on dealing with the climate in a way that their customers can understand. And there's a massive, massive gap in the small to medium-sized enterprises sector. Just a quick example of what good looks like. This was one of our top firms. A nice simple table. What we're going to do by these years, scope 1 and scope 1 and 2 separate from scope 3. Simple information. That's pretty good stuff. Quite rare. This is that stuff about trending I talked at. This is for Wincanton. Look at their 3 years. Low, low, and then a shooting up. So revenue shot up, but they're planning to go downhill. Whereas when they do an intensity measurement, which is the CO2 per million of revenue, you might argue that this little tiny short trend line, fingers crossed, points towards this point down here. But it's really early days yet to do trending. Main recommendations then, I'll crack on. There's more than these are some of the main ones. Unless the government extends the statutory needs to report on carbon to include a lot more firms, there's always going to be a huge gap here. People aren't going to do this unless they're mandated to do it. You have to include the scope 3 emissions to do a proper measurement, and they're not in the reporting requirement at the moment. So you get scope 3 in there. And even if you do the reporting really well, it seems to me it needs to come with a clear statement and a plan about how the firm's then going to reach net zero. Otherwise, they just report a lot of emissions for the next 10 years. At the Wiltshire level, really the council probably, I think their most powerful lever would be to really toughen up the money they spend of ours on buying services and goods so that they only buy sustainable provided services and goods. You know, electric coaches maybe, who knows? And I think they could perhaps use the planning controls to insist that when we do build new commercial infrastructure, like a massive great distribution warehouse up near the M4, it should be completely covered in solar panels and have all the very best in, which clearly is not happening at the moment. Business managers, all those in the small to medium size area, you've really got to get off base one and start doing some proper carbon management and reporting. And perhaps an incentive would be to understand more about the advantages of selling your products better if you could demonstrate you are running a low carbon business. And if you're doing nothing at all, you're a really small firm, I just recommend you've really got to start. And the place we found that was absolutely the best place to go for small businesses was called Zero Carbon Business. Fantastic government funded website, really, really good. So we've done all the stuff in phase 1 pretty much now. Later this month, we're going to try and run a webinar on the 26th of April to get more in the middle of a day on a Wednesday, I think, to try and get more business people and some of the organisations around the county involved who should be, Business West and SWLEP and people at the council who are interested in business. And then the focus for the rest of the year will be on how do we take the lessons we've learned from this work and use that to actually generate some action for change. Any questions? We're probably going to have a quick breakout. I could take a couple of questions if you like, or we could break out. I'll stop talking.